Hello, this is Michelle from East Ave Art, and today I'm going to walk you through the steps I took to paint this hot chocolate mug. As you can see, I added some garnish of a candy cane and a gingerbread man. So I started by sketching this out on my graph paper there, and that kind of helped me with the dimensions. And then I traced it onto some tracing paper, and I'm just kind of transferring it the old-fashioned way, just by adding some graphite to the backside of that, and then I'll transfer it over to my watercolor paper just by, going over my lines. And I think this is like a really good way to get your sketch onto your watercolor paper without damaging the paper. If you're like me, I erase quite a bit, so that saves the quality of the paper. And I'm starting with my candy cane, and I'm just putting some clean water down and then dropping in just a hint of like sort of a gray blue, because the white on the candy cane wouldn't be pure white, and I wanted to have a little bit of a shadow there as well. And so I'm going to wait for that to dry, and while it's drying, I'm mixing up a nice red, and I wanted to add like a little bit more of a deepness to my red. So a little trick I have is to put some brown in my red just to get something a little bit more of a vibrant tone. And I'm putting in my, I guess the peppermint part is the red part. I'm not sure with a candy cane, but so I'm putting in the red stripes anyway. And you can kind of see I did them on an angle just to give the impression that it's a 3D object. And that kind of goes along with where I put the shadow on the white, was kind of on the inside of the candy cane. And you can see I pulled up some of the red paint on the right hand side of the candy cane so that it looks a little bit lighter on that side, and then a little bit darker on sort of what would be moving towards the underside of the candy cane. Hopefully that makes sense. So I'm going to do the other stripes in a similar fashion, where I'm just really trying to use tone and shading almost to create this sense of that it's a rounded cylindrical object. Hopefully I've achieved that. Okay, so I'm going to let my candy cane dry and move on to the base of the mug. And I'm putting down just some clean water. And then I'm going to drop in, I decided to go with kind of an indigo. I think that's just a really, I don't know, it's a color I associate with January for some reason. And I hope I'm not the only one that has color associations like this. But yeah, so I'm taking a minute to just kind of drop in all of that clean water. And now I'm mixing up this really, really vibrant indigo. And I'm going to start dropping that into the layer of clean water that I have there. And this is like the fun part of watercolor, just to see what the paint does and how it interacts with the water. And I just think it looks so cool to see it sort of spread out in the area that you've wet. To me, this is a really appealing part of watercolor because it kind of just feels like play. And it really is something that makes me feel kind of like a kid again. So I'm just kind of establishing sort of my base layer of color, and I'm going to build up this color over the course of this video. I wanted to establish a reflection, and so even with my first layer here, you can see I'm pulling up some paint with a clean brush towards the rim and then along the side of the mug. And that's for the purpose of establishing a little bit of like light reflection. And I think that adds some realism to my painting, even though this is highly illustrative. So next up, I am mixing up a nice gingerbread color, so kind of a soft light brown for that gingerbread man, and I'm gonna go ahead and paint him in. I wasn't super fond with the end results of my gingerbread man. By the time that I got to the end of this, I just didn't really feel like he looked super 3D in the same way that my candy cane does. So that's something I'm kind of thinking about to improve on, maybe some of my consistency and making, the whole painting sort of go together a little bit better. I really wasn't super fond of how this turned out. I kind of wish I had done a marshmallow instead. Frankly, I prefer marshmallows in my hot chocolate over gingerbread men, so I think I should have just gone with my instincts on that one. All right, so my first layer of the mug is pretty much dry, and I decided to mix up a thicker consistency, a deeper version of the indigo. And I'm also, for the lip of the mug, mixing up a very kind of almost like a taupe. I think it's like kind of a nice contrast to the cool blue, is to have that kind of like warm taupe color on the lip. When I first put it on the page, I thought it was a little too intense, so I wanted it to be somewhat creamier, and so I added in a little bit of white paint. As you can see, I did, and I was happy with that effect. And so when you're doing this kind of detail work, don't be afraid to just move the canvas around to where you need it to get the best angle to paint. I'm kind of the queen of flipping my canvas around as much as I need to, just to get the right angles that I want. Once the lip of the mug dries, I'm going to go in and start slowly building up the color of the mug itself with that indigo. And I kind of like to take my time building up colors, especially with, the mug being such a big focal point of this illustration. It's easier to continue to build up the darkness of the color or the richness of the color with different layers. Rather than going on too strong and too thick. It's really hard to bring that back, right? So I think like a good strategy is, to use the sort of the lack of opacity in watercolor to kind of slowly build up. Use that to your advantage. See how it dries and decide what you want to do from there. So you're going to see me really slowly start to build up this color until I'm happy with the consistency. But I'm keeping in mind kind of what I set up with my first layer, where I have some areas that are being hit by the light source, like under the lip on the right side and going down the right side of the mug. I wanted to keep that area a little bit lighter to show that reflection from the light source. And so even though I'm building up my color, I'm going to keep that in mind. I also try to keep it a little bit darker directly under the lip of the mug, just to kind of show that would be casting somewhat of a shadow just based on the shape of the mug. So as I'm adding thicker consistency paint on there. I still want it to have like a watercolor look to it. So I also spend some time kind of buffing it out or just sort of smoothing out the harsh lines because I want to avoid that with the watercolor style. And at this point, I realized I should get to work on the handle. And I spent some time sort of thinking about how the light would be reflecting on the handle, and what sort of consistency of paint I wanted to use. So I followed a sort of a similar process as I did on the actual body of the mug as well. So at this point, I'm going to switch to a smaller brush because I'm going to paint the hot chocolate. And as you can see, like around the rim of the cup, I really kind of want a smaller brush to get that detail, precise line and not mess with any of my proportions. So at least when I'm painting around the rim, I want a smaller brush to make sure that I'm not messing up my painting. I always get like a little bit nervous at this point in a painting because, I don't want to make a mistake that would be hard to fix. And anytime I feel like I have too much paint loaded on my brush, like a second ago, you could see that I kind of like got rid of some of it on the paper towel. And again, I move the canvas around so that I can, paint from the angle that I want to paint in. So don't be afraid to do that either. And just to reiterate, so just like what I did with the mug, where I started with a pretty light transparent layer of paint, I do the same thing really with all of kind of the big sections. So you can see I'm doing that with the hot chocolate. To me, it looks a little bit light for hot chocolate. So I can always build that color up by adding more layers or deepening my color, adding a thicker consistency. There's a lot of options there, but if you start too dark, it's nearly impossible to bring it back down. After I put in the first layer of hot chocolate, I kind of felt like my gingerbread man looked a little dull and flat, at least in the color. So I decided to bring up the color a little bit with a little bit of a thicker consistency. And I also wanted to play around with making sure the gingerbread man had some, like, I don't know, texture to him. So I didn't want him to be all the same color per se, so I wanted some, areas to have been maybe a little bit darker, like especially areas around, where his neck would be or where his arm sort of meets his body, because I thought if I look at a gingerbread man, he might get a little bit more baked in that area, right? So I tried to play around with that a little bit, and here you see me bringing up the color on the mug handle. And I want to have this sense of shadow. So obviously like the underside of the mug would be a little bit darker. It wouldn't, of the mug handle would be a little bit darker. It wouldn't really be hitting much of the light. So that's where you see me adding some darkness there. I think I overdid it a little bit, but one of the ways that I fixed it was actually later in this video. I go back in with some gouache, some white gouache. And as I said earlier, I felt like my hot chocolate was a little bit not rich enough. It wasn't chocolatey enough looking. So I mixed up some blue purple in my brown just to give it that, you can see it on my palette, that like really, really rich dark color. And I wanted especially the darkest thickest consistency of that to be like where there's a little bit of a shadow from the gingerbread man across, the hot chocolate. And so I kind of tried to have that be its most intense around where the bread man would be like casting a shadow, or the candy cane would be casting a shadow. So I was trying to play around with this. I did spend a fair bit of time on that hot chocolate because I didn't want it to all be the same color. You can see it's like some areas are lighter, some areas are darker, and I think that gives a little bit of realism. And now I'm moving on to the gingerbread man. I'm putting in his eyes, and then of course his little buttons, and just kind of adding some finishing touches there. So at this point I pulled out my gouache tubes and I took some white gouache, and you can see I put it on my palette there. And I'm going to use it in a couple of different ways in this painting. So I'm going to use it to add some highlights to my candy cane there, and I'll also add some little tiny highlights onto my gingerbread man, like where his buttons, because they're like a little piece of candy, they might be reflecting some light. So I kind of build that up a little bit later. And in addition to highlights, I thought it would be kind of fun to just put a big snowflake on this mug. And so you can see, because the gouache is thicker, it allows me to paint right over the watercolor paint in a way that I would not be able to do with like white watercolor. Okay, so now that I finished my snowflake on the mug, I'm going to go back in and try to bring up that highlight that I'm putting on the gingerbread man. And from here, I actually watered down the gouache a little bit because I wanted to accentuate that highlight on the mug that I've tried to keep throughout this whole painting, but I thought just having like the gouache itself would really sort of accentuate that. And then I also played around with having some highlight on the top of the mug handle. And so you can see I'm sort of like playing around with how thick I wanted that to be, and I'm trying to like scrub up some of it because it seemed a little bit much. So I'm just trying to play around with like the value there. And one way that I achieved that sort of like more subtle version is I did add more water into the white gouache. You can see I'm just still going to play around with that. I get a little bit like perfectionist towards the end of a painting sometimes. So you'll kind of have to excuse me just sort of messing around with it until I'm happy, somewhat happy with it, I should say. I also thought it would be kind of fun to add in some little highlights just on the hot chocolate itself. It almost made it look like a hot tub to me that the gingerbread man was chilling in, so I thought that was kind of funny. So I played around with that a little bit as well on the surface of the hot chocolate with my white gouache. Okay, and here is my final version of this nice little hot chocolate that was kind of fun to paint on a cold day. And I hope you enjoyed watching this. If you did, please like and subscribe. And thank you so much for watching.